Welcome to the Day of the Swan, version 3. That's 3.0, just like Web 3.0. We're bringing you new information, and we've covered a lot of things today. We've covered AI, we've covered blockchain, we've covered Internet for Trust. We've covered the news, but now we're doing something different with a master from the US. He is from New York. He is a Platinum Swan. Howard, the voice of the guild, initiator of great ventures, one of the directors of OmniFuture's Live, is here to do a live podcast. He's here to lead us through one of his inventions along with Gina. And take us through it, Howard. You're on and we're recording. We're live to the world.
Thanks, Rob. So here's a question for everyone. When was the last time you invested an hour thinking about the future, other than today? Not what you're going to do next week, but rather the opportunities and challenges the world could present in the next 10 or 20 years, and how you can best position yourself to navigate them. For example, climate change. Everyone knows it's an issue, but how many of us have actually taken action? Most people haven't set aside time to really think about this. In fact, there's a 125-year-old quote, usually attributed to Mark Twain, that everyone talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Well, we'll do so today. Welcome to the OmniFuture Live. As Rob mentioned, I'm Howard Fields, the executive producer of the OmniFuture, and I'm joined by my co-host and partner, Gina Clifford. We're broadcasting live as part of the Day of the Swan 3 Common Sense Making event, presented by the Gray Swan Guild. And today we're taking a fresh and perhaps provocative look at climate change, specifically how the end of snow might change life on Earth over the next 10 to 25 years. No matter what you believe the causal factors are, there can be no debate that the global climate is changing and causing economic, political, and environmental impacts. For example, there are already communities around the globe that have suffered greatly due to the loss of snowpack and resulting water shortages. And many more have experienced increased weather volatility. Now, there are many opinions as to what can or should be done to address this, ranging from letting climate change run its course to making significant lifestyle changes, to leaving the planet altogether. Clearly, each approach has pros and cons. To better understand them, we've asked 4 teams to apply the 4 Futures framework to 4 specific scenarios. First, a continuation scenario, with further status quo growth and change, or what you might refer to as business as usual. Second, in a limits and discipline scenario where human behavior adapts to growing internal or environmental limits. Third, a decline and collapse scenario where we experience system degradation or failure modes as crises emerge. And fourth, in a transformation scenario where new technology, business, or social factors disruptively change the system, hopefully for the better. Now, our teams have already met, and we'll thank each of the participants individually, but I'd like to thank them now for contributing their insights. Today, our team leaders will present the outcome of those discussions. I've got 2 items of note before we get to that. First, the session obviously is being recorded, and we hope to make it available as a future episode of the OmniFuture podcast. And second, that we do plan to answer all questions even if we run out of time. So please submit your questions via chat and be sure to include your name and email address. And now to introduce our team leaders and their teams, let's turn the mic over to Gina Clifford. Gina?
Thank you, Howard, and welcome everyone. When you think about it, we have lots of stories from history that help us imagine things, how must have been, right? But we don't always have those rich stories about the future. So we challenged 4 virtual global teams to work through our futures thinking process and develop some narratives around 4 different scenarios, as Howard mentioned. This workshop will demonstrate the use of 4 Futures framework and a process for creating scenarios. Anyone can learn to use these tools and processes to take what's emerging or happening right now and imagining how these trends or signals might shape our future. These stories not only mentally prepare us for uncertainties about the future, they also empower us to bring the future into the present so we can do something about it now. We can use this way of thinking to start building our own preferred futures. So I'm excited to announce the teams that have graciously volunteered to go through this exercise and share their fascinating future scenarios with us. I promise you, these stories will captivate your imagination and challenge your ideas and assumptions about what the end of snow means for our futures. So starting with the continuation team, we have Stephanie Kusabab. Stephanie is the leader of this team, and she is the CEO of Ascentium Strategy in Chicago, Illinois. The continuation team members include Basir Riot, a foresight practitioner from Belgium, Nathan Gilead, former founder of Rethink Alignment and principal of Directed Curiosity in Raleigh, North Carolina, Ken Bonipon, brand storyteller, writer, consultant from Message Glue in Seattle, Washington. So Stephanie, please kick things off for us and share a bit about your collaboration process and then your continuation scenario. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Gina. Great to be here. And thanks to the wonderful team. We had some great conversations. I'll just jump in and say that we are, as Gina said, the continuation group. We use the process that was laid out by Gina and Howard. And Howard, I think maybe just skip to the next two slides forward, please. There we go. So the way that we implemented this process was that we used a mural board to capture our work as we went. We used that to share both articles that we read related to this topic that showed us signals and drivers of change that we might be interested in. The yellow notes are our own thoughts about signals and drivers that we've seen or interpretations of those articles. And then the green notes are our predictions based on those. And then we took those predictions and sort of grouped them, and the information, grouped them around the categories of population, technology, environment, governance, culture, and economy. And Howard has dropped the link in the chat. You are all welcome to visit the mural. Feel free to look around there a bit. And then we combined those different predictions into a story, sort of a first draft of a story, let's say. And that document is also posted into the mural. And then we took that and we created what's sometimes called an artifact of the future. And this artifact that we did was in the form of a op-ed piece. And Howard, if we could go to the next slide, I'll just introduce that. Sorry. Before I get there, the signals and drivers, I wanted to call forward a few signals and drivers of change that we had identified as part of the work that we did, so that you could be thinking about them as I read this scenario or this op-ed piece. One of the signals and drivers of change that we really resonated for us was the water supply stored in glaciers and snow that are declining, and the impact that those are having on reducing water from a runoff perspective. More than 1/6 of the world's population currently lives in regions that are fed by mountain springs and mountain ranges. And so as those glaciers and that mountain snow melts or stops occurring, then that melt doesn't run off anymore. And you'll see that as we talk through our scenario. The sea level rise is projected to extend salination of groundwater, decreasing freshwater availability for humans and ecosystems in coastal areas. The loss of snow in the northern hemisphere is causing a loss of solar reflectivity, which is creating global warming and actually exacerbating global warming. So these are some of the things that we were thinking about as we wrote this scenario. So I'll just pause there and go ahead and share with you our story about the end of snow as told by Amanda in her 2050 op-ed piece for the Global Herald. I was born in 1980, the year that Generation X gave way to the millennials. As they were called then, millennials are now just slightly younger, older people, and nobody calls them Gen X anymore. I'm just a senior citizen. When I was younger, our elders always seemed to talk about how things were better back then. My friends and I found it so tedious, but here I go, doing the same thing because of snow, or really because of no snow. I remember snow, and I dare say we were better off when we had it. As a kid, it meant fun. As an adult, it meant we could water our gardens in the spring and summer. It was a cycle you could count on, and it played out every year until it didn't. Ski resorts around the world were the first to raise a warning, which seems so typically human. When our fun is in danger of being taken away, we complain. But soon, the trickle-down effects became evident, mostly because nothing trickled down. Granted, we humans are slow to act. We're great in emergencies, although we do tire of them quickly, but we're lousy with prevention. Climate initiatives failed over and over because of the many and varied human biases and entrenched interests. Buy now, pay later. In the state of Washington, where our mountains filled with snow each year, folks had the luxury of denying climate change longer than some other states. But we saw directly the connection between that snow and our water supply. We had a pretty good idea that snow was important. Snow, melting snow, rivers, irrigation, life, renewal. It was a good system when we left it alone. But not anymore. No snow today means no water tomorrow. Deniers occasionally say that rain should be enough, but we don't store rain as effectively. We never really figured that out very well. Compare these two words, snowpack and runoff, which sounds more stable to you. And we could always count on the earth to throw us curveballs, if that ancient sports analogy still means anything to anyone. But for a while, we'd hear, we have no snow here, but too much snow there. It was erratic. I always thought it was a sign that when we harmed our planet's systems, they made an awful chaotic fuss before dying out altogether. Rockfall, avalanches, towns wiped out, roads destroyed, people stranded as the ice disappeared and the landscape splintered. It felt to me like we were riding a frantic, dying dragon. Speaking of frantic dragons, they tend to adapt better than we do, or die trying. I remember suburban families being shocked to see an elk, bear, or bobcat in their yard. Newsflash, there are no borders in nature. We're all animals. We need food, we need water, and we'll do what we have to get it. The other day, I read about a snow chamber. You can rent it for absolute quiet, kind of like those sensory deprivation water tanks we used to float in. And we've had indoor snow stadiums for a while now. Adults still want to have fun the way we used to when we were kids. Snow day, except now that fun will cost you in the thousands. When I was in my 40s, old people were terrified of cities. Too many people, too much crime. But now that's where everybody flocks. That's where there are systems that still work until they don't, until we overrun them with too many of us seeking water. In that way, we're just like water. We flow where we flow. Fear of immigrants has become fear of anyone because everyone needs water. If we allow them to get some, then there will be none for the rest of us. I remember decades ago reading the phrase climate refugees for the first time. Now we hear it daily. But don't cut us out of the game. Humans are very inventive, and we have a bona fide emergency on our hands now. We are supposed to be good at those. I read that science and technology are running at breakneck speeds to find answers. Will they? Too soon to tell, in my opinion. But we are seeing progress. Reflective and drought-resistant green roofs, next-gen solar panels that generate electricity while reflecting heat. The urban heat island effect is being mitigated. There's international cooperation, and now we have laws requiring all homes and buildings within 4,000 kilometers of the equator to have white roofs to help reflect the sun's rays. That's good. It slightly offsets reflectivity loss from melting glaciers. And those who don't comply have to pay fines, which go to fund more science and tech research. Before I was born, there was a movie called Soylent Green. You might have heard of it. It was about the earth running out of food, and it was supposed to be science fiction. But food needs water, folks. Farmlands have become deserts. Irrigation has become as valuable as oil used to be. Water. As a kid, It was sold in bottles and we laughed. Why buy it? It comes out of our faucet. Now it's an expensive commodity, trading, transporting. I never thought I'd hear about a water tanker coming into port, but now we have them. If you'll permit a senior moment of levity, at least if there's a spill, it won't be as bad as oil was. Activists have proposed that access to clean, fresh water should be a basic human right, but we tried that before. We're not good at preserving human rights, unless, of course, we're toasting them with plenty of our own clear water. That means we get a water black market. People steal water from banks or from tanks and trucks and pipelines, and even try to drill wells next to wells. Without it, we die, but you better not steal it. Governments have tried to implement policies like the Ethical Water Standard, which says we should source our water in a responsible way. Meanwhile, climate change continues. The Earth isn't done reacting to what we've done to it. The World Meteorological Association has been expanded to track and measure those new and sometimes sudden changes. I remember wishing when I was about 30 that I could afford a waterfront home. They were very expensive, but what a status symbol and measure of success. Today, the house I live in is in destiny to someday be on the waterfront and sometimes later in the sea. The ocean keeps coming. Water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. Until desalination. Now we're able to deliver fresh water in pipelines that stretch across the world. Well, at least in the richer countries. Drones patrol them, but inevitably, thieves that are inventive, or shall we call them thirsty humans, keep finding ways to tap them. We're not seeing as much of it here, but in some interior communities, there's a trend towards home rule, with local communities collaborating to solve local problems. Not sure what that means for a global society, but who knows, maybe they're onto something. I mean, I'm not saying our government is useless, but I mean, they have succeeded with Resilient Cities Initiative, and there are caring, decent people heading up the agencies involved. They even named a global chief heat officer who leads a worldwide climate and disaster response organization. They help reduce the consequences of extreme heat. Based on their success, some people have proposed the creation of the designated protector and advocate for what cold remains. Perhaps a chief winter officer? We'll see. There's still a lot of misinformation, and it's unfortunate, but I certainly understand the fear that drives it. Still, denying reality has not historically served the human race. This is a big problem, and I wish us well. For now, I'll leave you with this thought. I need a drink means something very different to me now than it used to.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was really, really great. We did have a couple questions that came in for the chat. If we have a few minutes that you could address it quickly. And also I would like to tag on to that. So Mike Wittenstein would like to know how you got from the process and the mural board to the actual story. And I'd like your quick feedback and your team's feedback on how this whole process that you put together and that we put together can help others, other companies, other individuals with their planning.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gina. As a strategy practitioner, I'm always thinking about how do we connect the dots, right? How do we connect the dots between this thinking and our acting as organizations? And in fact, I was at the conference for the International Association for Strategy Professionals this weekend. Futures and foresight was a big part of that conversation about how do we make sure that these are integrated into our planning processes. So just to step back from getting from the mural to the story, and then how do we use it? So the mural, and you can see there, I've actually uploaded our initial document, which Basir and Nathan put together for us, kind of combining all of the different predictions that we had, all of these individual predictions. And then we had the great benefit of Ken, who is a storyteller by trade, helping us to take those individual predictions and create this amazing story for us that allowed us to tell it in a very human way and talk about the impacts. And how we might use this, I'll just talk about it from a strategic planning perspective and then invite the team to share if they have other ideas. But from a strategic planning perspective, how we might use this is to kick off a strategic planning process with a group of leaders to be able to help them see beyond their current horizons, to see what might be coming next and things that they might need to be thinking about as a leadership team as they think about how do we get from where we are today to this vision of what the future might look like. That's really the strategic plan, is those steps that we can take to create a future that we want to create, or help to try to move the organization in that direction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate it. If there's any more questions for Stephanie and the team, please put them in the chat. We now move on to Mitch. Mitch, with Limits in the Discipline team, please share your process and then a little bit about what your scenario entails. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. What we're going to see here is that based on my long experience scenario planning, I modified this process somewhat to reflect more of the sort of best practices that I've accumulated over the years in terms of scenario planning that is more tied to strategic decisions. So if we can have the next slide. Thanks. And I think we skipped one. Right. The important thing to know here is that to start, in our experience, it's important to select a strategic decision focus to help guide the building of scenarios that would actually be useful in providing a test bed for strategies that would deal with the strategic issue that a given company or institute or government agency would have in mind. And so as a straw man here, we decided to base these on what should a near-term business strategy be to confront the lack of snow. And we'll move on to the next slide. The first step in this process is to identify high impact and high and low uncertainty forces that would affect our strategic decision. And this is just a brief brain dump of many of these forces, but certainly if we were doing a full exercise in this regard, we would generate a heck of a lot more. But it gives you a flavor for the breadth of forces covering everything from different aspects of technology to politics to trade to markets to biotech to energy management and storage that could have a very high impact on what kind of business strategy one would want to deal with the lack of snow. Next. The next step in the process is to basically cluster this very long list of high impact, high uncertainty forces into what we call axes of uncertainty. And just based on the list that we generated, we could come up here with at least 8 different axes that would cover everything from biotechnology to regulations to energy technology and the like. You can see what the issue is here. If each of these axes are given 2 endpoints that we would conveniently call high and low, and then characterize accordingly, we could generate up to 2 to the 8th power scenarios. That's just way too much to deal with in any kind of practical scenario exercise. And so what we normally do in this case are a couple of things. One is to identify the scenarios that are functionally identical and basically eliminate the duplications of effect and basic scenario description. The other thing we can do to reduce the number of scenarios is to use our judgment and fit with strategic decision to reduce the number of axes of uncertainty. And by reducing the number of axes of uncertainty, we would clearly reduce the number of potential scenarios. In my experience, 3 to 4 axes, if you're going to use that approach, are about the maximum you can deal with in a typical scenario exercise. Next. Based on these axes and these forces, we can see this is just a sampling of some potential trends, a continued increase in catastrophic storms, a gradual increase in global famine, initial population loss in cities and areas relying on the snowpack for water, increasing political turmoil in developing countries and regions, slow improvement in vaccine design, speed and efficiency, an increase in global pandemics and epidemics, energy storage R&D shifting from electronic vehicles to general power and grid management, and an increased need and demand for assisted living facilities and remote work capability. Again, this is just a limited sampling. And when all is said and done, if you take a look at the next slide, we see a basic, what we call a scenario logic paragraph that looks, that takes a look at some limited sort of intermediate level scenario in terms of gravitas that would help us create a more detailed scenario, something closer to the fleshing out that Stephanie read in her, and developed in her scenario, and would be useful as a test bed for some nearer term business strategies to help limit the damage and negative impacts caused by a lack of snow. Again, here in 2033, the trends that were evident move forward slowly. There's a global recognition of the dangers of climate change, but political and economic conflicts really keep us from fully meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, which are probably too conservative to ward off most of the long-term disastrous climate scenarios. As a result, snow becomes a rarity and accelerates population shifts away from areas that rely on the snowpack for water. This causes increasing ecological disruption, famines, regional wars, less global cooperation, and more epidemics and pandemics. While there are improvements and adaptive changes in ag tech and biotech research, that a lot more investment to the development of drought-resistant crops and targeted water distribution, these efforts are just not able to keep up with the growing need. The continued tension in this stretch between need, global conflict, and having to focus on putting out fires rather than deal with long-term issues results in a dangerous lack of ability to deal with long-term responsiveness. So this gives you a flavor for how this sort of somewhat modified scenario strategy can be used to create one sample test bed for more detailed business and technology strategies to help ameliorate the business and social implications of a lack of snow.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Thanks, Mitch. One question for you.
Yes.
Since you focus very heavily on technologies and did a lot of research and have a lot of understanding in this area, what trends are you seeing in your research that you incorporated into here that are the strongest signals, I guess, if you will, for what we could see in this future that you've painted? If there's one or two that stand out for you.
Well, I think the trend that I see is that from an early signals of change perspective is a shift from power storage focus on electronic vehicles to more worrying more about gross power storage as well as the intelligent grid issues. And in terms of the hydrogen economy, there's a lot of near-term research that has been focused on electrolyzer technology, which becomes an issue if you start dealing with lack of water.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
There's got to be more of a focus on other technologies.
Thanks, Mitch. That's great. If anyone else has any further questions for Mitch, please put them in the chat, and we will move on to Denise Zhang. Denise, with the decline and collapse scenario team. Take it away, Denise.
Thanks, Gina. I just wanted to make sure I introduce the folks on my team too, Gina. I think, do you have the, I just want to make sure everybody gets acknowledged. Did you have the names of our folks and where they're from?
Oh, I apologize, Denise. Let me go ahead and do that introduction.
Apologize for the intro. Yeah, thank you, Gina.
Yeah. Okay, so here it goes. Denise Zhang is our decline and collapse team leader, and she is the Director of Business Development for Raven Bay Services in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Decline and collapse team members include Akash Das, co-founder and strategic foresight lead for MeWe Studio X, New Delhi, India. Rob Tyree is the founder and managing producer at Ironstone Advisory in Toronto, Canada. Mike Wittenstein is the founder, strategist, and chief business advisor for Story Miners in Atlanta, Georgia. All right, there you go. Take it away, Denise.
I appreciate it. So our next slide is our storyline explores and extrapolates the decline and collapse of systems as the lack of snow impacts the world, a geography, a community, and an individual over time. So Howard, I'm just gonna get right to the punchline and we're gonna skip right to, there we go. So we looked at, again, as the lack of snow impacts the world, a geography, a community, and an individual over time. The impacts are immediate, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, then transitional, and finally end state. The metaphor we use to describe this thought process is a chain of falling dominoes. For example, over time, the immediate effect of snow melting, like no snow at the Four Seasons Whistler Resort owned by Disney, run by Elon Musk. Maybe Howard, you can just hit advance and we can start seeing some of these great storylines my team came up with. Or the next storyline, the new Toronto Mayor Donovan Bailey is announcing a beach volleyball holiday event, raising money for the homeless. Or the Rockefeller Rink is open all year for guess what? Swimming, no skating. Or fish needing to find new homes because the only reliable source of fresh water is aquarium water. The next set of dominoes to fall in the transitional state are farms being unable to grow crops, cities unable to support people, support services which can't continue, and decisions are made street gang style, fast, local, and with the loudest voices, not with science or knowledge. So we start to see things like farmland for sale, insurance becoming a gambling game, not true actuarial science. And finally, at the end stage, when the last dominoes start to fall and collapse, and perhaps people start to make the decision to leave Earth completely and move to the moon. And we see ads popping up to assist in vacating Earth in a last-ditch attempt to wring out every last bit of available revenue. So I just wanted to get to the punchline quickly for our team, but at the same time, I wanted to encourage the folks on my team to add their thoughts or how they thought this process went. So Mike, you had so many insightful thoughts when we met about this. Did I miss anything, or is there something you wanted to share?
No, I think you've covered everything so well. I can't turn my camera on because I think it's turned off. We had such a number of ideas and very different thinking styles. Everyone was an A-type personality. So for me, what was interesting about this process, which I had first heard about from Howard Fields, is that naturally everyone's thinking kind of blended together. Denise, I think the facilitation is very important on this, and Denise did a really good job of kind of managing everybody toward a common outcome. So that didn't directly answer your question of did we miss anything? I don't think so. But the dynamics of how this process works, I think, is what yields the most valuable outputs. Everybody working together and trusting that the other people are going to be doing their job well. When I noticed for myself, when I saw the ideas come around and become more fully fleshed out, that everything started to click. And for me, that was the most important part.
Great feedback, Mike. I agree. I think to get to the dominoes and that idea, the metaphor really took everything, all the thoughts together and put it in a way that we could see that there was an element of time and an element of locality or an element of impacts. I think that was important. Akash, you were part of this process too. Was there some thoughts that you had? I know we talked about inequity and marginalization, and I see they're in the chat too. But did you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts around the butterfly effect of decline and collapse that you wanted to share?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. I think I resonate with everything Mike said. I think this was a really interesting process, even though it was for a very short time. And kudos to you to actually bring all of our perspectives together. I think decline and collapse is generally seen as a sort of a scenario building exercise where we know where it's generally headed, you know, something more dystopian or something we have seen in sort of these movies that Hollywood makes. But it's important, I believe, that we cautiously look into decline and collapse scenarios because they become a guardrail for what not to do. And we have to do that very carefully. And one of the things that we were discussing, as what you pointed out, Denise, is one of the things that we really look at with respect to decline, with respect to loss of snow entirely, is that the effects are going to be a lot more nuanced in the short term, a lot more heavier impacts are going to be coming up in the long term. Coming back to that whole point of we overestimate short term and underestimate long term. So we try to look at how long-term scenarios are going to be impacted by smaller changes, starting with food systems effect. And we have to take into consideration that the business as usual scenario is going to play a lot of role into this. But of course, businesses as BAU scenarios where we don't really learn much from it and we continue to let it happen. So yeah, food systems collapse are going to happen. And by the time we'd probably see a lot of governments taking action, what we do see governments do in times of catastrophes or in times where they feel like control is slipping out is that they take policies and actions that may not be very equitable, that may not be very useful for larger communities, especially marginalized communities or communities that are at the losing end of the climate change. As we do know that climate change does affect people very differently. In fact, the people who are least involved in exacerbating climate change generally face the brunt of it. And we'd probably see more of that happening if we allow a situation like loss of snow to continue unabated. So that's one perspective that we did discuss when we were looking at this scenario. Yeah, Denise.
So Akash, can I ask you to build on that a little bit?
Howard, is that you?
This is Howard. We always have these debates about positive and negative outcomes.
Yeah.
Right. And Killian made a comment in the chat that basically said any positive unintended consequences generally will be massively overwhelmed by negative unintended consequences or outcomes. So I'm wondering, was there any discussion about, let's call it inaction-inspired violence from younger generations or those who really are passionate about these topics as things get worse?
Well, Howard, I think it's very contextual, right? I mean, it really depends upon the severity of a situation. And it also depends upon how many, how many variables in this particular equation we cannot control versus can control. So the positive unintended consequences may at times overwhelm negative unintended consequences, depending upon how quickly we are able to take action. So I don't really think there is a, I don't know, as per my understanding, it really depends upon the complexity of a situation. It depends upon how close we are to reaching a tipping point. Like, for example, if we are very close to reaching a tipping point in a planetary boundary, and we start taking accelerated action, there is a large possibility that if there is even a small hurdle, it can have massive ramifications. It will have unintended consequences. That negative unintended consequences may outweigh positively unintended consequences. However, if we take action in time, if we are working,
I'll be there in a second.
Yeah, Chuck, hi. Sorry, I thought Chuck had something to say. But if we take actions in a considerably, optimum, meaningful periods of time, I believe there is a possibility that we can outweigh negative consequences through positive actions. Yes, there is possibility. I think it's about time frame. It's about the complexity and the nature of the situation that we are looking at, Howard. I hope that answers the question to some extent.
Yes, it does. That's great. Thank you.
Howard, I'd like to weigh in on a thought here. It's Mike Wittenstein in Atlanta. Akash, as you were speaking, I was thinking if we were using this in a real world scenario, if this were sponsored research, for example, Howard brought up these, angry youngsters. I think that's how he called them.
Right.
I think it would be very interesting to allow them a seat at the table to help write the story as they would like to see it come out.
Yeah.
That's a way to represent everyone's views and to get rid of the exclusivity and the marginalization of folks, but bring them in and let them help write the stories and let those all compete with each other. So the story is such an important part of the process. Thanks for bringing that up.
Completely. I completely agree with you. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I make a very brief comment?
Absolutely.
So one, what was just said by you, Akash, either we're not communicating, which is entirely possible because there's kind of fractured conversation here in the chat over there. Regarding tipping points, we're absolutely already at them. We know that because, or at least within the range of them, that it's very likely they're already happening because of what we're already seeing. And one of them, for example, it's already been determined that possibly as long ago as 2008 or earlier, Greenland is already tipped. Not tipping, has already tipped. And so, so taking a perspective of if we act soon enough, then we might avoid these tipping points. That's already invalid logic. So we have to be very careful about this, and we have to understand that we don't have any choice but to move very, very rapidly. And that's something that people must keep in mind in their planning. Is very rapidly, very likely means 10 years to get like the boat turned. You won't finish getting to port, but getting the boat turned, we maybe have 10 years by a lot of people's different estimates. So just from a risk perspective, that's how we should be thinking about it. Even if none of that is true, that's how we should be thinking about it from a risk perspective. I just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks.
Thanks, Killian.
I
really
agree
appreciate the addition to the discussion. Actually, I very much agree with you on the timing. It might even be shorter than that.
Yeah.
Some people's opinions.
Great. I just wanted to make sure that Rob had his chance before we run out of our 10 minutes allotted time to toss in your thoughts on how you thought, or if you had some addition to our headlines. Because I love in your world that we still have a physical newspaper in the future. That's my favorite part.
That'll be 100%. I didn't say what they would cost.
Right.
I did send a digital representation, and it didn't get a carbon credit for it. I like writing fiction. I think it's fast and furious. I think that fiction is the top of mind, and it takes us 100 years each to come up with short ideas. So although Howard and Gina set up this construct and then channeled these wonderful minds together, and then we used some tools and built out and used them differently, I think the wonderment of doing this is really interesting. And then it's really personal. So taking a page out of Snowden and sense making, this is personal. I know that there are lots of questions of there are 8 billion other people on the planet that they have opinions, they're living something, they're breathing something. So are we. So the things I posted are on my mind. Like, what would happen if there was no snow in Toronto on December? It's like, yeah, I would go play beach volleyball on our Miami Beach version. This is a really personal story. And I've done it in the summer. Winter would be cool. But then I thought about, oh yeah, in the summer, it's going to be 45 degrees in Toronto and we'll need cooling stations.
Yeah, right.
So why wouldn't you treat an economy around like, okay, we got to build cooling stations? Because if you can play soccer in Qatar at 45 degrees in a non-electrically air-conditioned stadium and not have anyone pass out from heat fever, you can do that today. And then back in my insurance world, Howard, you know I live in the insurance world. Parametric insurance being sold today in India to shop owners, buying a very low-priced insurance that if the heat goes above 42 degrees, they get paid out a low sum. It is a dangerous form of insurance, Howard. We'll talk about that later.
It's gambling. It's gambling when you get right down to it.
Hey,
listen,
okay.
Rob, these are great points. We've got to move on to the last team or we're going to run out of time. So thank you. Yeah, we should have that conversation. You could gamble with Swan coin. That one. Okay, Gina, back over to you to introduce Kat.
Yeah, thank you. Great conversation there. And thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts. And, I know a lot of people had differences of opinions, but I would go into the chat and see Rob has posted about a book called Ministry of the Future. And that book lays out some pretty radical ways of thinking about how things could look in the future. And it covers basically all of our scenarios. So take a quick look at that when you get a chance. Now, on to the last team, transformation team. Let me introduce the team. Our transformation team is led by Kat Zaraski. She is Client Relations Manager for projectadvisor.com in Toronto, Canada. Her team members are Jean Seamster. She's a marketing and branding strategist in Boston, Massachusetts. And Louise Mowbray is the Managing Director of Mowbray by Design in London, England, and Cape Town, South Africa. So, Kat, please share your findings with us.
Hey, great. I want to start off by, you can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Just by saying that how I approach this and what excited me about it was just basically the idea of having a good conversation, to have an opportunity to share and build some collective intelligence and some ideas and to sit in the imaginal for a little bit. So I, transparently didn't focus so much on precision or trying to weigh all of these factors in a super scientific way, because in my perception, there's so many ways in which science tries to look at what the future is and can be wrong oftentimes. So wanted to instead first we sat and I kind of led us through a bit of a meditation to just sort of imagine, okay, it's the future. These things that we know are already occurring have picked up, have grown, have exacerbated. And what is that like for our lives? What is that like to turn on the news? What is that like to go shopping? What is that like with our neighbors? So that's sort of how we started. We wrote some things down from there, and then we looked into some of the signals and sort of just got some clarity on some points of disagreement and what we wanted to actually use as the signals. So just with that in mind, wanted to kind of share the context that we kind of came in with it. So Howard, we can go to the next slide. So we can skip that one. I think we've talked about that enough, and that one too. So these are sort of the main areas that once we had a discussion, our initial discussion, these were the things that came up the most. And Louise and I were able to chat about them additionally afterwards. And so this was sort of where we, obviously our mind goes to what are the main things that would concern humanity from a survival perspective? Like, what are those things that are going to make it difficult to just live in the way that we do now. And these were the things that we sort of thought of like needing water, not needing too much water in terms of flooding, needing our soil to be able to stay together so that we can grow things, and then so that landslides don't smoke us. We're already seeing like different migration things. I mean, obviously it's from, right now there's, the war in the Ukraine and stuff like that, but we see the massive impact that it has on surrounding countries like Ireland right now. So that's very fresh for me in my mind of how that's impacting national identity, how that's impacting economics and political situations. So I can see more of that occurring. We also, as humans, tend to be more agitated and prone to crime and violence in heat waves and in heat. So I was thinking about that. What is it like to walk down the street? And, just the breathing concerns of heat in general. I'm not really sure what smog will be like because we may be using less fossil fuels, so I'm not really quite sure about that, but a lot of people just have difficulty breathing just because of heat alone. So those were the things that I was thinking about. And Louise does have experience. She has a lot of international travel and living experiences. So she was able to share what it's sort of like in Saudi Arabia, what it's sort of like in different parts of Africa, and just had us thinking about sort of the difference between areas that can get flooded and the areas that may be extremely arid and hot. So like I say, I didn't focus specifically on anywhere else other than sort of what I can imagine, but there would obviously be different impacts in different parts of the world. So we can go, actually, let's go to the next slide. Perfect. Yeah. Populate the one previous.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not going to actually, however, this is going to be the last slide that I want to show, and then I'll just sort of describe sort of after that. But basically, just to kind of continue on with the drivers that we considered. So with population, I found that one an interesting one to think about because there could be, I think as we think to 2033, like that's not that far away. So I think we can sort of imagine some of the trajectories and trends that are currently occurring to continue into the next 10 years. And then after that, it gets really, who the heck knows, right? So right now we're sort of seeing a decrease in richer economies of births. And we're seeing migration to sort of make up for that in terms of the economy and taxation and all of that. But we are seeing fewer births in richer nations with more education and other things perhaps to distract us, and perhaps also environmental fears that we have, as some people don't want to have children because they're like, oh, well, if resources are scarce, that was a really big narrative in my prime childbearing years. So I imagine that's impacted women as well, where it's like, maybe I shouldn't have children. So I can imagine that continuing for the most part. And we also don't have economic incentives to have children in the way that humans did in agrarian times. So it used to be that children would help on the farms or they would go work at the factory or whatever. So that's not the case right now. They're just a waste of money, as cute as they are. So, so with all of that being said, I see that we saw that trend continuing. In terms of technology, so technology having to do with sustainability will continue to be on the rise. Again, this may not be the thing that solves our problem, but do we see that technology going away anytime soon? Do we see people not investing in that in the next 10 years? I certainly don't. I still think it's going to continue. So that will obviously help for survival, as well as technologies for the rich to make themselves more safe and comfortable. So we thought that industries would really boom that had to do with that. And I think perhaps, my personal opinion, we didn't necessarily have consensus on this, but I think desalination and water filtration will probably be very high on that list. In terms of the environment, I mean, not much to say here. We've kind of gone over that quite a lot. But there's that: flooding, heat, arid lands, poor air quality, poor soil, and then and how that impacts governments. So I think we can probably expect an increase of energy use restrictions, either rationing or high taxes for high energy goods and foods. Maybe meat will be heavily taxed or heavily restricted. Travel restrictions, since it's very energy intensive, perhaps car use restrictions. So I think we can probably expect to see, I mean, we saw this in COVID to whatever extent that we did, that when there's a lot of stress on a population, the government's able to justify a massive increase in control. So I think we will be able to see that. In terms of culture, I think more homesteading, more rooftop gardens, people learning more about how to grow their own food, and or being able to bring the place. So rooftop gardens can actually subtly bring temperatures down as we have more growth and a water table, I think it's called, that less water is just getting lost into the ground. So I think that's going to increase in popularity. And more, I think we can probably expect to see more ingenuity and inventions just made by people. Like, okay, I've got tomatoes growing on my bedroom wall, or I don't know, whatever it might be. We see, I mean, I've seen Orange is the New Black. I know about prison life. You know, when people have restricted things to work with, they become quite inventive, I think. So I think we can also expect perhaps more tribalism and more groups kind of sticking together. I think right now in this moment in our society, we're fairly individualistic in certain ways, sort of off in our own little worlds with our own little internet. And I think that we can expect to see people needing to work together more. And I know we're close to time, so I'll wrap this up really quickly. I think a lot of the foods
we do have an outro that we need to announce. So
okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much. If anyone has any other questions, send them in the chat and Kat will get to them. Thank you, Kat. Appreciate it.
That's great. Hey, Kat, thank you. That was rather abrupt, but okay.
I'm very, got to respect the time container, Howard.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to quickly thank our team leaders, our workshop participants, and everybody who joined today and participated in the chat. As we experienced last year, spending a little time focused on the future produces some outstanding insights. Gina and I have already discussed further embracing the use of artifacts for next year's Day of the Swan, perhaps employing a Gray Swan Guild's Got Talent approach. We'll have to see if we can pull that together. If you enjoyed today's session, the best way to keep up with what's happening in the OmniFuture is to become an OmniFuture insider by following us on our LinkedIn page or subscribing to the OmniFuture podcast. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. Immediately following us is the ever insightful Louise Mowbray speaking about future-focused leadership, and she'll be followed at 2 p.m. by Mitch Halperin discussing Cygnus Sprints, the consultancy of the future. This is Howard Fields and Gina Clifford reminding you that your future is whatever you make it. So make it a great one.